All right, well, let's grab our notes this evening then, and we'll get to our Bible study. Wonderful, wonderful stuff in the book of Ecclesiastes. I'm delighted to study through this book with you. Lots of learning on my part as well. I've been through this book in the past, but this is, I continue to, Lord willing, learn a little bit more all the time. And a book like this to get a little bit better grasp of where the writer and where God is intending it to go. So we've been through really almost in a sense the first cycle of all the things that are vain in this world that have no meaning. Remember, life without God has no meaning. And this is a tool to reach our world. They come to the conclusion as well, wait a second, what's life worth? And so this is an opportunity for us to share the gospel as well. So as we come to verse 4 of chapter 4, you can see that on our notes, verse 4 of chapter 4, we see that Solomon here will tie us back to the original theme of the book in chapter 1. We really are probably, again, you can structure the book in a couple of different ways as we try to analyze its structure from afar, from history, looking back. But this really, he's clearly starting around the tree again. Remember how we talk about their thinking as circular, and they circle around before they finally get to the point, and you're tightening the screw maybe and getting right to that center point. Well, we are clearly starting to bring up something that we've already touched on. Solomon has already touched on once before, and that's our labor or our work. Now, we talked about it back in chapter 2, and you can see in the notes here, I wrote these couple references down just under this first point. Maybe let's point out that first section of verse 4, chapter 4. Again, I considered all travail, all right? And notice on our notes, I considered all travail. And that word travail is the same word that was used back in verse 3 of chapter 1. As you can see on the reference I have there, the word toil. All the work, that's your blank there, toil, or labor is another way that it's translated here in the book of Ecclesiastes. So he's looking at all the things that men do. And now we're coming back around to it again. And he's going to look at it from a little different angle, provide some other perspective. Life is complicated. Every human being is a unique, complex person. We are all individuals. If ever, psychologists like to put us in categories. I remember if you've read like some of Tim LaHaye's books from years ago, all right, and are you sanguine or are you, whatever your temperament is, all right? Well, those can be helpful studies and analysis, but the reality is we're all mixed up. All right? You don't fit in a neat box. Now, the box that you fit in is you, right? And you are an individual, uniquely created by God. Now, why do I say all that? Because Solomon here understands that complexity. God does ultimately. And so, though we talked about back in chapter 2, and that's the other reference I have under this first point, about all of Solomon's work, and we called it enterprises. He's building cities, doing great feats. All right, that was his labor, and he found no worth or meaning in those things itself. Take God out of the picture, and there's no meaning. Well, now he's coming back around to labor, but now he's going to look at it really from the middle or low class. Can I put it that way? The middle or poor class, all right? We're laborers too, but I've never built a city. I've never built a building. So I really maybe can't connect super well with Solomon. Now, that was grandiose, and I get it, but now he's going to hit me right where I live, all right? So let's keep reading now. Chapter 4, verse 4. Again, I considered all travail and every right work, that for this a man is envied of his neighbor. This is also vanity and vexation of spirit. Now we have some interesting phraseology here in the Hebrew. The way the King James handles it, and I think it's fine, is that it looks from my perspective that other people are envying me for my right work. But it could be that Solomon is actually speaking about you're envying somebody else in their work. Look at our notes. So the second point, verse 4 of our first, man's run around, and that's what I'm calling life, all right? This whole thing about us working. It's like we're a gerbil on a wheel, you know? Your run around, all right? Man's run around is often motivated by competition. Now, that's really a nice word for covetousness. In many ways, the reason we do what we do in our labor is because we're trying to keep up with the Joneses. All right? That's called covetousness. I'm trying to one-up somebody. Now, this is a motivation that I think if we're all honest, it affects us to one degree or another, and something that we have to guard against even as believers. There is the heart tendency to make yourself look good and to be better than. Now, Paul talks about those that compare themselves among themselves as not wise. And yet we must know that that is a sinful but very much real motivation in all of our lives at times. We have to be careful. So why do I do what I do? Well, again, Solomon now is stepping back, helping connect with a world that has no God. And so you look at the world, and I think as believers you'd say, oh, yeah. You know, it could show up on your block. It's humorous to me. Of course, we're from the Midwest, and so it's not common for everybody to have a swimming pool, you know, in their backyard. But you know, when someone, and by the way, how long do you get to use a swimming pool in the Midwest? All that labor and all that work for how long? And then you got to either empty it out or turn it into an ice skating rink. Okay. And yet, if somebody on the block gets a swimming pool, guess how many more show up over the next year or two? Have you ever seen that? It's like, oh, yeah, you got to keep up with whoever, you know, if I stopped and I could ask each one of you, you would tell me who the Joneses are on your block. Does that make sense? Okay. This competitive spirit. And yet, what does Solomon conclude about this? So you win the competition. You get the promotion. You get a bigger salary. You got a nicer house. You got a bigger boat. Whatever it may be, this also, end of verse 4, is vanity. It's empty. And it's a vexation. It's a frustration. Thus, the frustration of the runaround, as we see in our title tonight. It's a frustration of the soul. As believers, we know none of that has ultimate value, does it? No eternal value. In fact, Solomon's going to come to that in a minute. But he's wanting to connect with this person that he's sharing the gospel with. Can I put it that way? And we all are aware of this. It doesn't mean that we're trying to build a city, but I want to build my little castle on my block, whatever it may be. And we face that. Now, so there's one side of the attitude towards, or the motivation for labor, is competition. But now he goes on to verse 5, and he considers the other angle of that. The fool foldeth his hands together and eateth his own flesh. That's kind of a gory picture, but it's an amazing proverb. Notice my notes. Man's reaction to the runaround. So maybe man comes to the conclusion, this is a big runaround. What am I doing chasing after the Joneses? Trying to compete in my job, get better than the guy next to whatever. And so what often can be the reaction, which is really an overreaction, it's man without God, man not being restrained by God in any way. So his overreaction leads to complacency. There's your blank. If I can put it this way, another simple word, I use complacency because it starts with a C, like competition, all right? But leads to laziness. Leads to dropping out of life. Which then ends, as we see in our notes, as Solomon says at the end of verse 5 here, which ends in self-destruction. That's what he means when he's talking about eating his flesh. Now, if this is not an amazing description of many of the young people of our day, they've dropped out of trying to work to take care of themselves. They are idle. They have no temperance, no self-control. They are all victims. And what does what does Solomon call that person? The fool. The fool foldeth his hands together and eateth his own flesh. Because the end of that pathway leads to self-destruction. Ultimately, it can lead to hell. All right, if you don't turn to the Lord, and a part of our labor as Christians, our work as Christians, is to take care of each other, our family's needs and our needs. We have a purpose for all of that. But you take God out of the picture, and either you're working to get ahead of the Joneses, or you say, phooey on it all. I deserve life, and why do I even chase after it? And I become a lazy bum, become a victim. I fold my hands. I'm just going to live for myself and me, and guess what happens? You destroy yourself. The very reason you stopped work becomes your destruction, and it ruins you. So, not a pretty picture, is it? So now what Solomon does here in verse 6 is he stops and gives us, if I can put it this way, a proverb, a little bit of wisdom, something that you and I will grab. And again, as we understand the purpose or drive of the book of Ecclesiastes, this is the carrot again. The carrot to draw someone to the Lord. What does he say in verse 6? Better is an handful with quietness than both the hands full with travail and vexation of spirit. All right? So he's providing an amazing balance here, and this is a biblical balance, and this is something that you and I should frankly strive to emulate, to live out in our life. Is when we add God in, what does he add? So look at our notes. Isn't it better to have a modest life? And that's the first part of the verse. Better is a handful, all right? You don't have too much, you don't have too little. Remember, whether it was Solomon or King Lemuel, actually, give me sufficient, this is Proverbs chapter 30, or 31, give me what is sufficient for me, not too much, not too little. If I have too much, I might curse God because I think I'm worth something, I've done it myself. If I have too little, I might become angry and say, God's not treating me fairly. He says, Lord, give me some balance here. It's somewhat the same concept here. God has called us, with God in our life, that we would live modestly. Does that mean that I can't gain wealth? No, but it is not something that consumes you, and in fact, you use your wealth for God's kingdom, not for your glory, keeping up with the Joneses. Now, that lazy man needs to be told as well, wait a second, you need to take care of you have a responsibility to care for your own needs. Don't think that life needs to be handed to you. And don't give up on life, because there's value to life. So get to work and start working. Get your hand full. So isn't it better to have a modest life with its accompanying peace? There's your blank. With its accompanying peace, or the Hebrew word there is rest. Quietness, as it's translated here. Better is a handful with quietness, instead of having the runaround. So whether you totally ignore the runaround like the fool, or you're right on the runaround and running as fast as you can, in both scenarios, your life is being dictated by the runaround, and it shouldn't be dictated by that. There's a better life. There's a life that has your needs cared for. It may not be grand, but that's not what life's about. It's a handful. You've got your handful, but you have a lot of peace. And that ultimately brings, is the carrot that says, wait a second, that's what I want. Believer, don't miss that your testimony of living a life of trust and peace in the Lord through trial is radically different than the world. And they don't get it, but they want it. And God can use, do you realize that God can use trials in your life to be a testimony? It may not be that you have to learn something from the trial. He may bring the trial in your life because he wants you to be a testimony. I.e., Job. Remember what Job's description was in Job 1 and 2? He was a perfect man. He was upright. He eschewed, he hated evil, and he did what was good. God's description of Job was that he was already mature. So why did God allow all that to come into his life? So he could become more mature? Well, we discover by the end, yes, there was some things in his life. He was still a sinner like us. He defended himself instead of his God, and that was the point that God wanted him to learn. But the big picture is Job stands as a living testimony to so many people that life is not about the here and now. That I can be content with God alone. Thus, my famous, the Leviathan and Behemoth at the end, chapters 40 and 41, right? God is great and God is big and powerful, and we can trust him. And that's where God, and so your life can be that testimony to the world. So they watch and observe in the midst of a trial, and you don't fall apart. You're leaning on the Lord. You have your handful and quietness, and that is astonishing to them. So that's why I put this big question in bold. This really is the centerpiece of this section of the book of Ecclesiastes. Where can I find that? Well, of course, we know the answer. You can find it in God. In God giving you the right purpose of life, a clear understanding of what life really is about, so that you're content with your handful. Not striving to have both hands full, but having all kinds of travail and vexation of spirit. All right, verse 6. I'm content and have wonderful peace with my handful, God caring for me, providing for me. So that can be a sweet testimony. So let us not, as Christians, be found chasing after riches and prestige. Let us live modestly. Let us not be a fool and say that, all this life is just a bunch of garbage. It's a waste of time, and so I'm just going to kind of check out. I'm going to drop out of life. No. Let's have a handful through proper means with the peace that God gives and be a sweet testimony to the Lord. So now, as Solomon concludes this section, he comes back to the runaround again and points out another amazing fact about the runaround. Verse 7 and 8. Then I returned. All right, so he's going to come back, and I saw vanity under the sun. Again, he's kind of borrowing the theme from verse 3 of chapter 1. Everything's empty under the sun. No God, it's empty, it's worthless. And what is one of those emptinesses? Verse 8. There is one alone, and there is not a second, all right? What that Hebrew section is saying is, man is solitary. He doesn't have anybody. So he doesn't have friends. He doesn't have family. He's a loner. For whatever reason, he's a loner. Yea, he hath neither child nor brother. Yet is there no end to all his labor. Neither is his eye satisfied with riches. Neither saith he, for whom do I labor and bereave my soul of good? Now, the Hebrew here is really potent. It appears as though Solomon is actually claiming these words as his own. In a sense, he connects. Why do I do what I do? Do I really do it for myself? And why do I labor for all this stuff for myself? Why? So he's making a point of connection with this person that's all alone and yet still labors and labors and labors. And for what? So he goes on. This is also vanity. Yea, it is a sore travail. And again, with this last phrase, he's connecting back to the theme of the book. The word labor there is the same word as we find travail in verse 4. When he's talking about being satisfied, neither is there his eye satisfied with riches. He's talked about that satisfaction never being complete as well back in chapter 1 and verse 8. He's not satisfied with this stuff under the sun. The word good here, why have I bereaved my soul of good? And he's used it in a positive sense in some of at the end of chapter 2, verses 24 to 26. Let us enjoy the good that God gives. This man doesn't know what to do with the good that he has. He's all alone. What do I do with this good? It's just vexing my soul. All right, so see all these points of connection. So here's our point. Man's runaround is of itself no good companion. You see, so the word companion is your blank there, companion. So you see here, what Solomon is trying to help us understand that, okay, The world sometimes, I'm gonna work because I'm trying to take care of my family. Or I'm going to take care of my friends and I want to be a good neighbor, those kinds of things. And yet, really, he's trying to cut all of that away to say, even a solitary soul who has no one to provide for, all right, he doesn't need to provide for anybody, just himself, he cannot find peace in the runaround either. It's still vanity and vexation of spirit. In a sense, he has every right to live for himself because he has no one else. And yet he finds meaninglessness in living for himself too. Folks, labor without God is vanity. Now, use your life and the handful that God has graciously given you through your labor with a peaceful heart to be a sweet testimony to the world. So let this, here's the practical application, and then we're done. You may use this passage then with your co-laborer at work and say, hey, why are you working? Well, why do you come to work each day? Let that fry their mind for a minute. And maybe not give them an answer. Solomon doesn't give the answer yet. I mean, he gives us a clue in verse 6. All right? Now, it depends. You follow the Spirit's direction here. But let him think. Let him mull it over for a while. And then, maybe he'd say, well, why do you come to work? Well, let me tell you why. And you share the wonderful blessings of God in your life and the purpose for work and labor to provide for your needs, but also to provide for the work of the Lord. And the joy and peace it brings, that you can be content with a job that he's absolutely bored with. Wish he had a better job. He lives for the weekend, not for the work. And you can be that testimony. So, the practical application is ask a question of a co-laborer. Hey, why do you go to work? What are you here today for? Oh, is it to promote the boss? Well, that's really fun, huh? So use it as a wonderful testimony. Let's pray. Lord, thank you for the truths that you've demonstrated to us, helped us understand tonight. Lord, without you, labor is just a total waste. It's a runaround. Some people work to try to get ahead, but at the end of the day, that has no eternal value. Others throw their hands up in the air and say, phooey, I'll just drop out of life. And that's wrong too. And so, Lord, I pray that you would help us to be that testimony of rejoicing in the handful that the Lord has given us and having a quiet and peaceful spirit. Knowing that my relationship is right with you and being able to have a sweet relationship and understanding with other people, that only comes from you, Lord. Lord, they can never find companionship in their money and in their labor. And so help us to use that to tell them about a God who can bring complete friendship and companionship, bring a satisfaction of soul that is beyond understanding. May we be a sweet testimony for you this week. In your name we pray. Amen.